Now I'm going to be talking again about some of my recent videos. Recently, in my last video, I said Prouty lied about going to Antarctica at the time of the JFK assassination. I think that's true. One of the things I used was an AI question and answer about when the McMurdo station first turned on their nuclear reactor. Someone in the comments expressed doubt that the AI was being honest about that. Well, this is a plaque on the site, and it does say that the reactor was first fired up in March of 1962, just as the AI said. So I think that's probably a pretty sure fact. However, if you're a Prouty fan and you want to grasp at straws to defend your hero, that nuclear reactor was shut down and restarted multiple times. And I think even, though I don't have the specific dates, it said somewhere, even in November of 1963, it had been started up again. So if you want to grasp at straws to defend Prouty, you can say that he wasn't there for the first starting of the reactor, but he was there for that subsequent starting. I don't think that's true. What Prouty described was this big delegation of 50 people from Martin Marietta and other companies going down there. And I would think they would be going there for the big opening event rather than just one of many restarts that occurred. So I think I'm right about this. I think Prouty lied about going to Antarctica, and I think it's because he was involved in the assassination. However, I think there might be a problem for my idea that Prouty was standing in for Steve Weiss. Prouty was 46 years old at the time of the assassination, and Steve Weiss was a first lieutenant. And I found some more information on Steve Weiss. He was 24 years old at the time of the assassination. So I was thinking, oh, well, that bolsters my case, A first lieutenant wouldn't be a 24-year-old. Little did I know until I went looking that it is lieutenants, first and second lieutenants, typically are soldiers in their 20s, not in their 40s. Now, according to what I've seen online, it's possible to have a lieutenant in his 40s, but it's very unusual. And it seems to me that this assassination conspiracy wouldn't want to do something like this. That is, they wouldn't want to put a 46-year-old in a position where you would expect someone to be half that age, because that would be something that would be very memorable and might create suspicion in retrospect among people who are looking for a conspiracy. So, and I think Ed Coyle is a very good witness and an honest witness, and he wouldn't necessarily have mentioned that Steve Weiss seemed to be about twice as old as you would expect a lieutenant to be, but I think he probably would have mentioned it if it were true. That is, if there was something weird about Steve Weiss, I think Coyle would have mentioned it. Now, he did go into some detail about Steve Weiss. He said here that Steve Weiss was getting married while they were working there, and that everybody chipped in and got him a wedding gift, but then that he didn't invite them to his wedding. So he's giving some details here about why he doesn't like Steve Weiss. But again, a 46-year-old can get married and he can be a lieutenant, but it sounds more like we're talking about a young guy here, and that if he was a 46-year-old or somebody in his 40s, that Coyle would have said so, and he didn't. So I think probably it really was Steve Weiss in the office, or it really was somebody in his 20s, and that he wouldn't have stood out, or he would have, if it was Prouty, he would have stood out as someone too old to be in that position. And as I said there, I found more information on Steve Weiss. He is a real person. I wasn't sure he was a real person. Apparently he was a real person because he has an obituary here. And it says here, Stephen Robert Weiss was born in New York City to William and Sherry Weiss. Steve attended Texas A&M University, where he graduated with his officer's commission. He entered the Army in 1961, beginning a 21-year career in counterintelligence. He retired as lieutenant colonel in 1982. A highly decorated officer, he was proudest of being awarded the Legion of Merit and the Combat Infantry Badge. He was stationed in many locations, notably Korea, Vietnam, Germany, and in Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon. So Prouty probably did know him, and maybe that helps my case against Prouty. Also, with this obituary, there's 3 photographs, but one of them you can't really see him very well. But these 2, you can see him very well. I think the first one here might be sometime after the assassination. He looks older than 24 there. But this one here in black and white, this might be him around the time of the assassination, or maybe even a little before it. So now that I have photographs of Steve Weiss, I can compare him to the man in Dealey Plaza, whom I originally identified as Weiss. And I think it's pretty clear this is not the same person, that it's not Steve Weiss in Dealey Plaza. The hairline looks very different. The hair color looks very different. Now, somebody did mention that the neck on this person in Dealey Plaza was too long to be Prouty's. I don't think that's true. I think in photography, different photography, people's necks will look different depending on the angle of the camera, the clothes they're wearing, and what position they're striking, what pose they're striking, or whatever. So I'm not bothered by the neck apparently being too long. However, if you compare the neck... Well, actually, if you look at the 2 pictures of Weiss, in one picture he looks like he has a much longer neck than in the other one, doesn't it? But anyway, if you compare the photography we have here, that person who is complaining about the neck being too long might have a point. It does look more like the Weiss neck in the younger picture of Weiss. But as I said, I think you can't depend upon that in photography. I think it varies greatly depending on the camera angles and the clothing and all that. So I don't think it's Steve Weiss in Dealey Plaza. I think it's Fletcher Prouty in Dealey Plaza. Now, my first thought when I noticed that this guy seemed to be with Powell was that it might be Ed Coyle, because Coyle says he went to Dealey Plaza with Steve Weiss and to get Powell out of the building. So I thought that might have been Coyle. Turns out Coyle was 35 years old at the time. I don't think it's impossible that that person is 35. That person in Dealey Plaza looks older than that to me. He looks like he's in his 40s, which would fit Prouty. But I don't think that could be Ed Coyle. I think Coyle was such a good witness and an honest witness that if he had argued with the Dallas police about Howard Brennan, that he would have mentioned that in his 2 ARRB interviews, and he didn't mention anything at all about that. In fact, it seemed like his visit to Dealey Plaza was uneventful except for him helping to get Powell out of the building. And so I don't think it's Steve Weiss in Dealey Plaza, and I don't think it's Ed Coyle in Dealey Plaza. I think it's Fletcher Prouty. So if Prouty wasn't at the office but was in Dealey Plaza, that would imply a different scenario than I was thinking. Prouty would be some kind of a point man, but not working in the office, presumably, unless he was Colonel Pate. He might have fit very well as Colonel Pate, and there is some weirdness about Colonel Pate replacing a Colonel Frindell, and I don't want to get into the details of that here because they're not clear in my mind anyway, but it didn't match up. I noticed that the dates given by Elmer Boyd's widow and the ARRB for Frindell didn't match up. So maybe I'll look into that later. But anyway, I still think this is Prouty in Dealey Plaza. I don't think it's Weiss, and I don't think it's Coyle. And now I'm going to do a little reading from Prouty's book here, which can be found online, because in this book he mentions Antarctica, though he doesn't mention going to Antarctica at the time of the assassination. I'm going to start reading here. This is a bit before Antarctica, but it's part of the same story. At one overseas base heavily involved in air activities in support of the agency and of the foreign nationals the agency was assisting, there were a number of aircraft of doubtful ownership commingled with other aircraft that were on loan from the Air Force. These aircraft were flown and maintained for the most part by a civilian facility that had the appearance of being a civilian contract carrier, but there were also a number of Air Force and Navy personnel with the unit in various capacities. The primary base unit was under Navy cover and had been for years as a result of an earlier mission. With such a mix of personnel and equipment, it was all but impossible, and certainly impractical, to attempt rigid controls in the manner customary on a real military base. One of the planes assigned to this unit was a small transport aircraft common to all three services and built by the Beech Aircraft Corporation. This plane was flown by the officers of the staff and was used for shorter administrative flights. One of the pilots who flew it regularly came in to land in a bad crosswind one day and momentarily lost control of the plane after it had touched the ground during landing in what is called a ground loop. He recovered in time to keep from doing very much damage, and no one was hurt. The plane needed minor repairs to be good as new. However, this pilot, who also had maintenance authority at this conglomerate base, ordered that the plane be hauled out behind the main hangar and covered with a large protective tarpaulin. It was left there for months, and unknown to others on the base, a report was filed to Washington that it would cost more to fix the plane than it was worth. So the plane was scheduled for what the military calls salvage. This means it is put up for sale to the highest bidder for scrap, or whatever. No one on this base, which was primarily managed by the CIA, gave this a thought, and after a while the plane was not even missed. During this time the pilot, a major who was actually a career CIA employee serving in his Air Force Reserve grade, was transferred back to an assignment in Washington at CIA headquarters. He had not been there long when he located the paperwork on the plane and made a bid in his own name and that of a friend to purchase the plane for scrap prices. Since no one else even knew where the plane was, and even if they had, they would not have wanted to go to that remote place to get it, and of course, since any other bidder would have believed that the plane was a total loss, there were no other bidders. The major bought the plane in a perfectly legal maneuver. He then applied for a brief vacation. Dashing back to the overseas station where he was well known, he arranged with the local maintenance crews to have the plane fixed at a very little expense to himself, and in no time he and his friend shipped it back to the United States. Their profit on the deal was many times more than the actual money they had invested, and no one ever knew about it because all of the records had been kept in highly classified channels. Secrecy can be used for many purposes, and this was just one of the uses to which it can be put by those of the team who know how to get away with it. Prouty doesn't mention who this person is, and I wonder who it is. I wonder if it's Prouty himself. Probably not, but that's interesting. And now getting on to the Antarctica mention. Emboldened by this success, the same man arranged a few years later to be the project officer on a rather large operation in Antarctica. He and his companions worked up a team that was going to accomplish some very special work on that remote continent. They had 2 Air Force twin-engine transport aircraft heavily modified and modernized, and then got together millions of dollars worth of special electronic and photographic equipment. They filled the planes with equipment and still had so much left over that they had to have the Air Force fly it to Panama, where it caught up with the Navy's regular shipments on the way to McMurdo Sound. They had this priority-classed equipment put aboard, even at the cost of offloading some of the Navy's own equipment. Everything was brought to Antarctica, where these men established their own base, satellited upon the Navy from McMurdo Sound, whereas most of the Navy's supplies for Antarctica are either shipborne via the Panama Canal or airborne from Christchurch, New Zealand, this group flew down the coast of South America to Argentina and then took off from there with elaborate assistance from the Argentine Navy. After their project had been completed for the year, they reported that one of the planes could not operate because of some sort of engine trouble, and that since the dangerous trip back with only one plane would be too hazardous, they planned to leave both aircraft and all of their equipment cached in the Antarctic. All personnel were flown out by the Navy and returned to the United States. It just happened by coincidence nearly 1 year later that a U.S. military officer stationed in Argentina reported the arrival of a civilian who was working with contacts in the Argentine Navy to see if arrangements could be made privately to bring those planes out of Antarctica. This chance tip was followed up, and it was learned that the same man had decided that if he could get away with one plane, he might as well try to get away with two much larger aircraft and with millions of dollars worth of equipment, which was, in his mind, fair salvage somewhere on the ice cap of Antarctica. With the excellent cooperation of the Antarctic project officers on the White House staff, and with the support of the Navy, all of this equipment and the planes were recovered and returned to service. Now, Prouty doesn't say so explicitly, but the implication here is the guy was caught. They got all their stuff back. I guess he does say that. Doesn't name this person, and doesn't say this person was punished at all. Being a CIA operative, maybe he wouldn't be punished. These are special cases and do not reflect upon the system so much as they do upon the actions of a few individuals. The problem is that the U.S. government is not properly constituted to deal with such actions when they are cloaked in heavy secrecy wraps, and the incidence of such happenings is far greater than it need be, since in most cases there should not have been any security over any of the projects. The cost of allowing the secret team to operate in secrecy is high. Now, I find this interesting because of the mention to Antarctica, but also in that obituary on Steve Weiss, one of the things mentioned is this: one of his greatest adventures was sailing on a 3-masted bark across the Drake Passage from Ushuaia, Argentina, to Antarctica. And if we look back at the Prouty story, that thief, who was a major at some point in the CIA guy, member of the secret team, he went to Argentina to make arrangements to get these airplanes back from Antarctica. Now, this could be just a coincidence, of course, but it could be that Steve Weiss was actually involved in this operation, because it's one of his greatest adventures involves going from Argentina to Antarctica on an old sail ship. So this interests me. It doesn't prove anything, but it could be that Steve Weiss was known to Fletcher Prouty because of this incident. Whether Fletcher Prouty himself was involved in this incident, or whether he was doing due diligence for the Air Force or the CIA or whoever, I don't know. But it could be that this is how Fletcher Prouty came to know Steve Weiss. That's what occurs to me. So anyway, even though I can't say what the exact details of the arrangement were, I think that Fletcher Prouty was probably in control, in command of James Powell and Steve Weiss. Though I don't know what his job may have been in the military at the time, whether he actually worked at the 112th Group office or not. But I think that's him in Plaza there.